For folks who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. We are a national organization working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. They cover a wide range of educational topics for activists across the country. I do want to note quickly that these are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press, more than happy to chat with you, but please reach out separately. This is not the place for press questions. By way of an agenda today, I'm going to give some framing around the topic for today's call, and then I'm really excited to pass the mic off to Iliana Paul, who is the Deputy Director of Sierra Club's Industrial Transformation Program. She's going to share with us in more detail about what's at stake in the USMCA review for the climate. Then after Iliana's talk, we're going to take some of your questions and talk about action steps that folks can take to make a difference on this over the next month. Then, also excited to share that our Trade Justice Executive Director, Arthur Stamoulis, is going to hop on quick just to give an update about the tariffs. I know that's a thing on everyone's mind, so we're going to get some updates from Arthur at the end of the call. I want to remind folks to put questions in the Q&A as we go along. We're going to take as many of those as we can. So, folks who attend these calls regularly will know that one of the biggest issues facing the trade justice movement this year is the review of the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA. As a little bit of a reminder and some background information, the USMCA is the renegotiated version of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that Trump negotiated when he was in his first term in office, right? The original NAFTA from the 1990s had a series of bad outcomes for climate. Among other things, it created an investor-state dispute settlement system that allowed oil, gas, and other companies to attack countries' climate policies. It allowed for companies to evade environmental regulations by moving between countries in search of weaker standards, right? Creating a race to the bottom for environmental protections. And in an agreement that was fully enforceable for the many corporate giveaways it contained. The original NAFTA had really weak enforcement tools for the few environment and labor-focused provisions that it included. And the ones it did include were not in the actual agreement. They were an afterthought that were negotiated as a side agreement. So all that is to say that there was no love lost between the original NAFTA and the trade justice movement. And when presented with the opportunity to renegotiate the agreement during Trump's first term, trade justice's leadership, many of our partners welcomed that opportunity. When all was said and done with that negotiation, the USMCA made some improvements relative to NAFTA, removing most but not all of that investor-state dispute settlement system that we just talked about, for example. It also had some provisions that were worse than the original NAFTA, things like the digital trade giveaways for big tech that we've talked about in prior briefings. But the bulk of the USMCA is identical to NAFTA. And now, 5 years into that USMCA, we know that that pact is the impact of the USMCA is largely identical to the impact of NAFTA. One positive thing the agreement did contain, though, is a mandatory 6-year review process, which is getting underway this year. So here to talk about the important outcomes the environmental movement is pushing for in that review process is Iliana Paul of the Sierra Club. Iliana, I want to say thank you so much for joining. Please share with us everything we need to know about climate in the USMCA review. And as a reminder, please, folks, put questions in the Q&A feature for Iliana. We're going to get to as many of those as we can at the end of her presentation. Iliana, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm going to share my slides. And just a little disclaimer, I am getting over COVID. So if I cough, sniffle, or clear my throat, I appreciate your understanding. We are all human, right? So my name is Iliana Paul. I'm the Deputy Director of Sierra Club's Industrial Transformation Campaign. We do a lot of work on clean manufacturing, but we actually are an evolution of Sierra Club's old trade program. So we are still leading the work on climate-friendly trade over at Sierra Club. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about the USMCA opportunity, what it can mean for climate, why it's so important, and why it could be such a pivotal moment for trade justice writ large. Here's just like a really brief overview. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the intersections between climate and trade. I know a lot of folks on here are well versed in the subject, but just a little refresher, and then go into the way that Sierra Club has been working on trade over the last handful of years, which is a slightly different tact than we took in the past, and then going into what we see as the opportunity for USMCA. Hillary just did a really good job of laying out some of the problems with NAFTA and USMCA. So I might touch on those again briefly. And then I'm going to go into more detail on what we are hoping a new agreement could include. And then we'll do questions. So without further ado, very simply, trade shapes how we make things. The manufacturing practices we have in one country can be strongly dictated by whether or not we are focusing on exports, by whether or not we import certain materials. And that also means that the environmental standards and labor standards or the protections for those things can vary really significantly depending on the pressures coming from trade. And so that's part of the reason that it's such a big deal for climate. Free trade, as you probably all know, has created what we talk about as a race to the bottom, where often companies, corporations are setting up shop in countries that already have less environmental protections, fewer human rights protections, fewer labor protections, or the promise of investment is causing countries to lower their protections. This is not a system that we want to maintain or perpetuate. This is a system we want to reverse. And just as like a little bit of a climate note, we're in the US, we're importing goods that were made with about as much CO2 as we produce at all US factories combined. So from the perspective of my team that works on industry and manufacturing in particular, this is a huge loophole that we need to close. So we do think we can use trade tools to support clean and innovative manufacturing, strong environmental protections, high-road jobs, respect for human rights, and more, but we need to make some really big fundamental changes to the system. So our theory of change, like I said, is all about creating that race to the top. We are really lucky to have a number of partners in this work where we can look holistically at trade justice and responsible trade. And we really want to transform the way that we trade goods in support of a clean manufacturing future, a clean energy future, healthy communities, good green jobs, and a stable climate. A little bit more on the just on the nexus, because I think industrial decarbonization or clean manufacturing and trade is increasingly a talked about intersection. And this is sort of the way that we think about the connection between these is that on the domestic side, we need things like investments in sustainable manufacturing practices, clean technologies, clean or green focused procurement. So using public dollars to buy goods that are made with lower embodied emissions, less pollution overall, and then having good standards for monitoring, good data collection. All of that is really important domestically. But what has to underpin that are our trade policies, because again, if we are making something more cleanly in the US or in Canada, but then that good is no longer like competitive on the market because there are there are less cleanly made goods that are cheaper, it really undermines the sort of domestic work that's happening. So climate is trade is a really huge piece of the sort of clean manufacturing puzzle. Our strategies around trade largely, I think, actually haven't changed. It's just a little bit of the framing that we use. So we want to change the old rules that have really been problematic. Hillary already mentioned ISDS. If you're not familiar, basically there are lots of corporate giveaways and trade deals. And ISDS is specifically a system in which corporations can sue governments for public interest policies, among other things. The Keystone Pipeline case brought by what is now TC Energy against the United States is a great example of when President Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline that would have transported dirty tar sands oil. The U.S. was sued for $15 billion. So ISDS happens in what we often refer to as shady and ad hoc tribunals, but basically it's a pop-up system. There's no accountability. It's extremely one-sided, and it can have a cooling effect on climate action specifically, but also public interest policies more broadly. So that's something that we want to end writ large. We also want to make sure that state-to-state challenges are limited in a way that they are not also hindering climate ambition. So Sierra Club has for a while been working on this concept of a climate peace clause. We released a discussion paper with TJEF, I think 2022 now, about sort of what a climate peace clause could look like. And that's another big component, but basically it would be an agreement between two or more countries to not challenge each other's climate and green jobs policies. And we think that that is another key piece of having a more climate-friendly, climate-forward trade system. The other piece, sort of the second category is creating new rules. So like Hillary said, there's not a lot of really strong binding enforceable environmental rules and trade agreements. So that's something that we want to make sure is baked in from the outset, or like we have the opportunity with USMCA upon renegotiation or revisiting of the text. We also want to make sure that there are provisions that support, directly support policies like green domestic procurement policies and green jobs policies, in addition to the climate peace clause effort that is really about limiting challenges too. So it's not just let's not prevent this from happening, but actually let's encourage this. The last piece is a little bit more specifically about mitigating climate impact. So we talk a lot about a carbon dumping fee. Some of you may be familiar with the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. The idea is that basically a tariff, a duty, a fee would be levied on goods coming into a country depending on the embodied emissions of those goods. And this is one way to close that carbon loophole that I mentioned earlier. We also, and this is a little bit of a tricky one right now, and I'm sure Arthur will have lots of interesting things to say about tariffs later, but we do think that we can strategically wield tariffs on unfair imports, particularly when it comes to pollution and climate. I want to just, and again, I think Arthur will probably get into this, talk a little bit about why, in the context of this moment, the USMCA opportunity is actually such an important opportunity for climate-friendly trade. So we see Trump being a bully. I don't think that that's surprising to anybody. We see a lot of chaotic actions around the tariffs. They're announced one day, they're canceled the next. They're paused, they're on, they're up, they're down. And while I think many of us know that tariffs can be used in strategic ways, including as part of industrial policy, which was a little bit of that kind of circular diagram I showed, the way that Trump is using them is not strategic. There's no plan. There's no domestic investments. There are all of these pieces missing, and it really undermines the legitimacy of tariffs. The other really big piece, though, is that it looks like increasingly Trump is leveraging tariffs to negotiate new polluter-friendly free trade agreements. We've heard like all sorts of things from the White House, from Washington generally on this, and it could be really bad to open up lots of agreements with lots of countries and not have the right standards in place, not have the right protections in place. And so we think that sort of, and obviously the timing of all of these things is up in the air because, like I said, things are chaotic. We think that at least getting our vision out now for what a good USMCA could look like, or what a better USMCA could look like, can also influence these negotiations. So we have strategies to meet this moment, as kind of terrifying as some of it is. This is a quick timeline. I'm not going to walk through it, but the NAFTA fight started a long time ago, and we are still in it. And the first mandatory review of the USMCA is coming up next July. But actually what happens this summer is that the review of the environment and the labor chapters begin. And so that's part of our focus right now, is preparing with specific thoughts for how the environment chapter can be improved. Again, Hillary mentioned a little bit of this, and Sierra Club, now more than 10 years ago, so before my time, but released a report with a number of partners on the harms from NAFTA. And some of the things that that report highlights are the creation of an export-focused manufacturing sector in Mexico led to rampant pollution and poor working conditions, similar export-oriented farming, lots of reliance on fossil fuel-based inputs. Lots of fossil fuel development came out of NAFTA, and rights to access to that There was also increased mining activity. And then the ISDS piece, which I already mentioned, has been, is a huge problem, not just for climate, but for a lot of issues that I think we all care about. So there have been some improvements, but like Hillary said, a lot of it has stayed the same. And in fact, there has been some backsliding. So the enforcement language around multilateral environmental agreements is no longer as strong as it was. There used to be a provision saying that 5 of the MEAs, basically parties' obligations under 5 of the MEAs was basically more important, took priority over NAFTA rules. That no longer exists. It in some ways makes the export of Canadian tar sands oil cheaper. There's a preservation of some ISDS, in particular for fossil fuel companies who are especially ardent users of the tool. And there are other aspects of USMCA that undermine domestic regulations. So, as Hillary said, again, this was negotiated under Trump's first term. It's up for review. We think that despite the challenging environment, our voices matter, and making sure that our message is heard is really important. We think we can use this review to get a better agreement. It might not be this review in 2026. There is a possibility that there could be annual reviews after this. But we still think that the flexibility or the opportunity in USMCA to have a review period can help facilitate a better agreement. And again, part of getting this vision out now and sharing it with you all is making sure that we're not supporting agreements, both this agreement, but other free trade agreements that prop up polluters at the expense of communities and workers. So very high level, what we are fighting for are strong, binding, and enforceable environmental rules, policies that support climate action, and end to corporate loopholes. So it's no surprise that these are basically the sort of 3 categories of strategies that I already mentioned. And they're a really good fit in USMCA. And so it makes our advocacy in some ways easier, in some ways a lot harder, because there's obviously lots of corporate interests and other powerful folks who oppose these changes. But at least from a sort of mental policy standpoint, there's some coherence. So we want to make sure that there are real obligations. A lot of the language in USMCA is quite weak. For example, parties shall endeavor to investigate, or parties shall, understand, rather than like real strong language. And so that's something that we want to say, we want to see changed. We also want to make sure that the commitments under multilateral environmental agreements are respected regardless of the rules of this trade agreement. We also want to see a real enforcement mechanism. So one of the things that doesn't exist or didn't exist before USMCA is, as folks who attended last month's Power Hour with the colleagues from UAW may have learned, USMCA was novel in that it created a rapid response mechanism for labor violations. This is a facility-specific mechanism. People can bring complaints against specific facilities for labor violations, and there's real enforcement, there's real teeth to it. So something that is one of maybe our top priority or second priority is getting a mechanism like this designed for environmental violations. So basically point source pollution issues. We think it's really important, one, to maintain our own environmental protections in the US, and 2, to not outsource pollution to Mexico. Again, it's not that, like people around the world are being plagued by pollution, and we can change the rules of the way that companies do business to change, to fix that. It's not that any one country is more deserving of pollution. It's just that many structurally unfair, unequal, unjust power dynamics make that happen. And so having some level of enforcement is one step towards rectifying that. We also, and this is a little bit of a different piece and ties quite into the clean manufacturing focus that my team has, is creating some sort of uniform and consistent reporting for greenhouse gas emissions so that all three countries can really have a harmonized approach to reducing emissions from emissions intensive industries. If folks are familiar with the way that greenhouse gas emissions reporting and other sort of pollution reporting is done in the US, there's actually often quite a variation in the way that companies get to report. So you can submit different types of estimates. There's engineering estimates, there's estimates based on your fuel use. And this creates both data that is not super reliable and also data that's not necessarily consistent between facilities. So we think that if we can set up a tri-national scheme, monitoring, reporting, verification scheme, that could also actually eventually expand globally. We also want to see provisions that protect domestic procurement and especially domestic green procurement and green jobs policies. So similarly to a climate peace clause feature and just generally upping the ante on climate ambition. A commitment to take stock of the agreement's climate and environmental impacts. I think that there is a better system in place now for compliance with the labor provisions. And so we want to make sure that there's something similar going forward for the environmental provisions. And then the last piece is to fully end ISDS between the three countries. So that's our list of demands. And just like a little sort of, like I mentioned at the outset, this has to be a group effort. This is not just a fight for the environmental movement. This is a fight for all of us. So I'm super fortunate to be able to work alongside Hillary and Arthur and many other folks to really build grassroots power, really build people power to force these changes. We work with labor unions, faith groups, consumer rights groups, family farm groups, responsible trade advocates like TGEF. And then when I say and you, it's like just regular people, Sierra Club members and supporters, anyone who wants to get on the bandwagon. Every voice counts. Very quickly, the timeline, and this is somewhat up in the air because of, again, all of the chaotic pieces of Trump's trade policy. But the official review of the environment and labor chapters should begin this summer. There right now is scheduled to be, or in theory, is scheduled to be a public comment period in October of this year. That could happen sooner, it could happen later. I recently heard indications that the free trade agreements with other countries that are being negotiated now may take priority, and so the USMCA timeline could be pushed back a little bit. And then next July is sort of like the make it or break it moment. So all the work really has to happen before then. I already mentioned this, but we know that there are other trade deals on the table, and we don't, in many cases, we have a lot of the same demands. We want to make sure there's strong, binding, enforceable environmental, labor, and human rights protections. We don't want to see any more ISDS and other corporate giveaways that, especially that undermine climate action. And we want affirmative support for ambitious climate action, which I know in this political climate is quite challenging, but it's really a cornerstone of any new, more responsible trade regime. So if you want to learn more about the work that my team is doing, again, it's the Industrial Transformation Campaign at Sierra Club. You can go to sc.org/IT volunteer and sign up, and you'll get updates from the campaign. And you can also go to our website, which you see here. I'm not going to read the whole URL, but our little, we have a page, like a subpage on climate friendly trade that has a bunch of links and kind of pulls all the pieces together. So there's some great resources there as well. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Iliana. I think that was a super helpful overview. We have a lot of questions in the chat for you, which is great. A place I really wanted to start with this conversation is like all the things that you list are really good demands, right? They're demands that have been part of a trade justice organizing for a long time. What do you see as the opportunity to actually make progress on environmental issues during the Trump administration?
That's a great question. And something I think about a lot is like, what is realistic to achieve now versus what are we laying the groundwork for future, maybe when there's like a friendlier administration, if Trump doesn't declare himself king. Um, so, I actually think in some ways the environmental rapid response mechanism has some legs. Like I said, and like many of you know, USMCA was negotiated under Trump. That's where we got the labor RRM. We know that there are folks in of many constituencies who think that environmental RRM could be really beneficial. Um, and we even know that like folks in the Trump administration have made arguments about pollution dumping or excess pollution being an unfair trade practice. So there is part of me that thinks that that actually could go somewhere. I think we need a lot of support behind it, a lot of grassroots support behind it, and a lot of expert support behind it, and it needs to be thoughtful and well designed. Um, but that piece I think is really important, um, and 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 feasible. In terms of what else is possible, Trump has been on record saying that he opposes ISDS. Biden also had opposed ISDS, and so I think you know a significant narrowing of the corporate giveaways could be possible on the sort of the grounds, the argument of national sovereignty. Um, Other things I think are achievable if we put up a good fight.
That's helpful framing. Thank you. I really like this question, and I'm gonna jump in to answer it first. Thank you, Eileen, for posing it. What about critical minerals agreements? A lot of climate policies are focused on clean energy, but that means more mining for minerals, more environmental destruction, displacement of indigenous communities, etc. I'm really excited to share, and I will say more in the action steps that Trade Justice is hosting a premiere of a 12-minute documentary short that Iliana was part of the process for. That is next Wednesday. So I'll share more about that in a little bit, but thank you for giving me the chance to say that quickly, Eileen. Iliana, critical minerals agreements, how does that play in with these U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement conversations? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. And a lot of the non-USMCA FTAs that may be negotiated right now could have critical minerals components. So it's definitely something that we're aware of. We have signed on to sort of a list of standards about what critical minerals agreements need to contain. But some of this is the same. Is like we need really strong environmental standards. I think in particular, making sure that there's clear obligations with respect to indigenous rights and free, prior, and informed consent. That's a really big piece of the what one of the harms that we see coming from critical minerals extraction and development. So in some ways, it's similar. We want there to be accountability. We want bad actions to be prohibited, and we want there to be accountability if those actions occur anyway. Um, we and and we want to make sure that critical minerals agreements or agreements with a critical mineral focus have a strong environmental component, but also are really clear on the labor and the human rights piece.
Super helpful. Um, Ileana, this is also an excellent question. Will Congress have a voice here in voting for or against a new USMCA?
I think that actually Arthur maybe like is more of a procedural authority on this. Um, I think it depends if there. My understanding is that if there's new implementing legislation, then yes. If there needs to be new implementing legislation, then yes, Congress must have a voice. I don't think that uh, it is explicit. But Arthur, do you want to jump in?
Hey everybody. Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Ileana. Under the Constitution, Congress has the right to set U.S. trade policy. They should get a vote over any new trade agreement that sets binding standards on the United States, binding obligations in terms of policy. Whether they will get a vote in practice probably depends in part on whether the changes to the USMCA require changes to US law, and also how forcefully Congress demands its constitutional authority be respected. I'll leave it there.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. You did talk a little bit about the rapid response mechanism already in regard to the environment. I think it is a cool opportunity, like you're noting. One thing that I get asked about a lot and that is also popping up in the Q&A is the good regulatory chapter. Do you have any intel on what's happening there?
I have no intel on anything. No, I don't have any intel on what's happening there. But we are working on a more detailed list of recommendations that really at least starts with the environment chapter and looks article by article. Um, and we're also making recommendations for some other pieces of the agreement and revisions there. So the good regulatory practices chapter, or regulatory good practices, whatever it is, does typically allow corporations to undermine domestic regulations. I think in the case of USMCA, corporations can challenge regulations as they're being developed in a way that sort of was unique actually when USMCA was came into force, and so that's definitely something that we want to make sure no longer exists. Any sort of polluter friendly policies that could really undermine genuine environmental progress would be a no for us.
Helpful. One other thing, this person writes, I remember your amazing presentation on the climate peace clause, from another power hour. Do you see there being a path to advance that conversation in the USMCA, or do you think that that's off the table?
I think that there could be maybe like a shadow climate peace clause in USMCA. So I think that there could be some specific language um, that isn't specifically called the climate peace clause and like has like a little bit more nuance that could be the basis for building a bigger and longer standing climate peace clause. Again, this is all if USMCA gets like really renegotiated in the next year or so. There is a possibility of moving to annual reviews. So that means we would have opportunities to revisit the text again and again until we have a more favorable environment. Um, and there's also a possibility that everyone will want to walk away from the deal. In particular, I think Canada and Mexico are not having it with us right now. Um, and so I think a climate peace clause in North America actually could have a lot of legs, if you will. Maybe not at this moment in time. I think some element of it could exist though.
That's helpful. There are a lot of really good questions here that we are not going to have time for. So, Ileana, there's a few questions here that I may follow up with you just to get answers and get back to some folks because there's some really, really good questions here. But I know that I have some action steps I want to cover, and I know that Arthur really wants to jump in on tariffs. So, we're going to leave Q&A there for right now. Thank you so much, Ileana. Really appreciate you sharing. I want to turn to a few action steps that folks can take. So as Ileana outlined when she put up that timeline, ahead of this whole USMCA review process, we're really working hard to get some demands in front of the administration. One of those is an organizational sign-on letter, which folks who attend these briefings regularly will remember from last month. I'm really excited to share the update that letter now has nearly 400 signers from organizations all across the country, all across the Trade Justice Coalition, environmental groups, labor unions, human rights groups, family farm and food groups, folks working on access to medicines, AI, privacy, and more. The Sierra Club is on at the national level. Also 350, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Blue Green Alliance, unions like the Machinists, SEIU, AFT, CWA, USW, groups like National Family Farm Coalition, the Consumer Federation of America, the National Organization for Women, a whole bunch of faith groups, and many, many more. So there's lots of groups on there. The thing I really want to drive home is that we want to get this letter in ahead of that USMCA review process, and we would like to add more groups to that letter before we send it to the administration. So that letter includes things that you've heard today, adding climate and environmental standards backed by strong enforcement tools, ending ISDS, acknowledging connections between displacement, migration, environmental degradation, all of those things. One of the most helpful things folks on this call can do today and over the coming weeks when it comes to climate in the USMCA review is please share that letter with organizations you're a part of. Get them to review it, get them to sign on, share with organizations in your network that might also sign. I think Clayton just dropped a link to the letter so that folks can access the letter text and a link to the sign-on form in the chat. Again, please take a look, share that. If the barrier to your organization signing is you want someone to come speak to your board or executive committee or something like that, please reach out to me about that because I'm also happy to try to make that happen. And then the last thing I just wanted to say on this quickly is that this is really focused on organizations. There will be petitions and individual actions coming up throughout this campaign, but this one is really focused on organizational signers. So please take a look at that. Like I said, Clayton put it in the chat, and I'll be sure to include it in my follow-up. In addition to that organizational sign-on letter, there were 58 members of Congress that sent a letter to the president urging him to make improvements to the USMCA that would improve climate, protect workers, family farmers, and more. The Sierra Club has a really cool thank you note tool where if your rep signed, you can send your representative a quick note of thanks for signing that letter. So I think Clayton is going to drop the link to that tool in the chat in just a second. Please take some time to see whether your rep signed. If they did, send them a note thanking them for their support. And then the last thing I wanted to say in terms of action steps, which I already hinted at just a little bit ago, is that next week, next Wednesday, 5:30 Pacific, 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern, Trade Justice, in coordination with colleagues at the California Trade Justice Coalition, will be hosting a premiere of a 12-minute documentary short called Critical Minerals, Creating a Just and Sustainable Clean Energy Transition. I think Clayton is dropping the RSVP link for that event in the chat. Iliana also very graciously gave her time to recording material for that, along with a handful of our other partners. I did get a sneak preview of that earlier this week, and I'm really excited to have Mira on with us on the 23rd to talk to you about critical minerals, the documentary itself, and have a conversation about what a sustainable energy transition looks like. So for folks wondering about that, please, try to be at that conversation, share that where appropriate with folks working on climate or minerals related issues. I want to check quickly. That was kind of a fast. Yeah, yes. So I will send all of these links in a follow-up email either this afternoon or tomorrow, depending on how quickly we can get the video posted. So don't stress about having to open them all right now. Yes. Okay. Awesome. So I think I'm going to check one more place to be sure we dealt with all the questions because I see a lot of little windows. All right. So seeing no other questions, I want to turn quickly to something that I suspect is on everybody's mind right now. I want to welcome Trade Justice's Executive Director, Arthur Stamoulis, to give an update on the tariffs. We are going to have a few more minutes to take questions at the end of his presentation, so please keep putting those questions in the Q&A. Arthur, what do we need to know?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary, and hello again, everybody. Let me just start by thanking Iliana for that great presentation and everyone for all those great questions. This is really important stuff, and I look forward to working with you all on it. As Hillary mentioned, I asked for some time today just to make some comments on the recent tariffs chaos and, in addition to what Iliana said, just give a little bit more of a heads up about other pending trade negotiations beyond the USMCA, even though the USMCA does remain our top priority. And I guess the first big picture thing to say is the mainstream media really tries to to portray the trade debate as either you're for business as usual on trade or you're for what President Trump is doing. And we need to remember that there are alternatives outside of those artificial limits. And that if we want an economy that works for working people on the planet, we need to push for those alternatives. The free trade system of the past 30 years is fundamentally broken. And what Donald Trump is doing right now is not going to fix it. So let me start with tariffs. There's just so much misinformation out there about tariffs right now from the corporate side, the neoliberal side. We're seeing a lot of well-meaning people buying into the concept that all tariffs are bad. At the same time, how Trump has imposed tariffs has been so sloppy and so reckless and so self-serving that major damage is being done to the cause of responsible tariff usage, and it makes it hard to have an earnest conversation. Generally speaking, the Trade Justice Education Fund is pro-tariffs. Used right, tariffs can help promote good-paying jobs in the United States, promote a more just and sustainable economy globally, and can help build fairer and more resilient supply chains. So I'm going to quickly outline some basic comments on how tariffs can be used towards those positive ends. And in doing so, I think it'll become clear that that's not what Trump is up to. So if one of your goals with tariffs is to create good paying jobs in the United States, you need to understand that tariffs do not magically create jobs in and of themselves. Tariffs can create an incentive for buyers to preference domestic sourcing that helps protect jobs that already exist from foreign competition. It can help incentivize more domestic production, but tariffs don't in and of themselves build factories. Investment policies, public procurement policies, infrastructure development policies, other industrial policies, in addition to tariffs, are what actually contribute to new manufacturing facilities being built. And so if your goal is job creation, you couple tariffs with those other sorts of industrial policies. And we saw this during Trump's first term. The tariffs that he placed on Chinese goods back then did not create jobs in the United States. If anything, they shifted some production from China to other low-wage nations like Vietnam and Malaysia. But it was only after the Biden administration not only kept but actually increased tariffs on Chinese goods, and then critically coupled those tariffs with significant new industrial policies that we finally saw new factories being built in the US and US manufacturing employment start to increase. And so, flash forward to today, not only is the Trump administration not coupling its new tariffs with other industrial policies, but President Trump has flat out said that he wants to kill existing job creation programs under industrial policies like the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Two laws that have created the biggest boom in new manufacturing plant construction in the United States in over 30 years, since before NAFTA, before the WTO, and Trump says he's going to end them. So on domestic job creation, Trump is actively stripping what's needed to create American manufacturing jobs. But what if your goal, with tariffs isn't so much job creation, it's just promoting fairness, trying to create a more level playing field for American producers? If that's your goal, you're going to target your tariffs at specific bad actors, or better yet, specific unfair behaviors. And you're going to partner with other countries to try to single out and isolate those bad actors and unfair behaviors. What you're not going to do is treat imports from allied countries that have similar labor and environmental standards the same as imports made by forced labor, by child labor, under other abusive conditions, under anti-competitive pro-monopoly conditions. So, 25% tariffs on Canada, an ally with similar labor and environmental standards, with whom, if you were to take oil out of the equation, we already have relatively balanced trade. Those tariffs don't level the playing field. They don't promote fairness. They don't create jobs. Neither do 10% tariffs on Australia, another country with similar labor and environmental standards with whom we had a trade surplus. So, Trump's tariffs aren't coupled with the industrial policies needed to create good paying jobs. They're not singling out unfair behaviors either. They're lumping all imports together, no matter what conditions they're made under. Let's move on to cost minimization. To be clear, a lot of the stuff we hear in the media about tariffs and consumer costs is wildly overblown. Regardless, there are steps an administration can and should take to reduce tariff costs to consumers. The most obvious step is not applying tariffs to things that we will never produce here at scale. So, absolutely use tariffs along with other policies to support auto and aerospace manufacturing, solar panel manufacturing, steel manufacturing, other industries. But 10% or higher tariffs on coffee, on bananas, things we're never gonna produce at scale, that we're always gonna have to import. That does not create jobs. It only raises prices. And I'll also say the president has existing authority to tackle price gouging. Every day in the news, I hear stories of retailers preemptively raising costs, of retailers raising costs far and above the costs that tariffs actually impose. And remember, tariffs are imposed on the import wholesale price of an item. They're not on the final consumer price that you and I pay. I heard a story on the radio just this week about insurance companies threatening to raise insurance prices on people's existing cars, supposedly because of tariffs. I mean, this is price gouging. In a lot of instances, companies are using tariffs as an excuse to raise prices, not because of real price increases that they face. And no steps are being taken at all to combat that price gouging. And finally, if tariffs are used as part of a package designed to create jobs in the US, the revenue the tariffs bring in is obviously going to decrease over time as domestic goods start to displace imports. I mean, hopefully that makes sense, right? You use tariffs as part of a package to create more jobs and more production in the US, your imports are going to decrease, and thus the tariff revenue from those imports is going to decrease. So tariffs that are intended to create jobs cannot be used to replace existing tariff revenue. Nonetheless, Trump and his billionaire advisors have repeatedly said that they plan to use tariffs to justify new tax cuts for the rich, which is clearly a big part of their agenda here. Less taxes for themselves, less public services for everyone. And so, just to recap on tariffs, the Trump administration isn't using them in the ways needed to create jobs, to level the playing field, to minimize cost to consumers. And it is talking about using them to excuse tax cuts for themselves and their billionaire buddies. That's not the story we're getting in the media. The story we're getting in the media is tariffs are evil. We know that's not true. The other thing I want to flag for people and sort of expand on what Iliana already said is that various administration officials have said that more than 75 foreign governments have reached out to the White House already seeking trade deals aimed at lowering tariffs. These trade deals provisions matter a lot. And unless we make a stink about it, it seems very likely that many of these are going to be rapid fire executive level trade agreements that come along much faster and with even less public oversight and public participation than we typically get. So let's talk about the contents of these trade deals for a second. The Trump administration has talked about wanting other countries to lower their tariffs in exchange for lowering ours, which to me sounds an awful lot like free trade agreements. More so, the administration's National Trade Estimate report came out just the other week. The National Trade Estimate report is a report the US government puts out every year listing other countries' policies that the US wants to eliminate because it considers them quote unquote barriers to trade. So, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, under the Biden administration, had dramatically scaled back the types of policies listed in the NTE report. But the Trump administration's new report is a return to the bad old days. It has 397 pages slamming countries' access to medicine policies, food safety policies, consumer privacy policies, AI oversight policies, financial regulations, and more. And so, between tariff reductions and advancing this wish list of corporate giveaways that undermine public interest policies, it's hard to see how these bilateral trade deals won't just be more of the same, although potentially with some additional evil crammed in there on, say, border militarization or imprisoning deportees or whatever other fascistic nationalist, baloney that the president wants to prioritize at any moment. The things that we're pushing for in the USMCA review: strong labor and environmental standards with swift and certain enforcement, direct wage increases, an end to corporate giveaways for big tech, big ag, and big pharma. Those are the things we need in a bilateral trade deal with any of the 75 plus countries the Trump administration claims it's talking to, whether that's Japan, Korea, India, Argentina, the DRC, Vietnam, the UK, or anywhere else. Um, I can't tell you exactly how and under what processes and timelines these talks are going to proceed. I don't think anyone within the Trump administration could tell you that yet with certainty. And I also don't think we should necessarily expect consistency between one trade deal and the next. But what I can tell you is they started this 90-day clock ticking last week, with the pause on certain tariffs. President Trump has said that it would take himself a day to negotiate the deals. And so trade negotiations that typically, took years to negotiate, I would not be surprised seeing taking just months, and in some instances, potentially only weeks. And unless we convince Congress to demand some oversight, again, these deals are likely to be less transparent than ever. Details released only after the deals are in place, no role for the public. And so, what I ask from each of you first is that you please take a second now to write your Congress members, encourage them to demand an oversight role, both for Congress and for the public, in ongoing and pending Trump trade deals. I believe Hillary or Clayton will paste a link to an easy web tool in the chat. I'm not going to say anything else important. So go ahead, click that link now, start contacting your senators and representative. And beyond that, just be on the lookout for any other outreach from Trade Justice and our partner organizations about specific bilateral negotiations over the coming weeks, because ultimately, like, it's going to be up to us to demand that there's a role for people and not just billionaire advisors in these trade talks, and that the outcome of any deals is something that actually works for working people in the environment and not just big corporations. I think I'll pause there, and if we've got time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Arthur. I want to encourage folks to put questions for Arthur in the chat. I think the question that's there now that I'd like to start with, Arthur, you kind of hinted at it already, but if you don't think that Trump's tariffs are really about job creation, what do you think they're about?
Yeah, no, that's the question. It's a great question. And a big part of this, as I stated earlier, is it's about using tariffs to justify tax cuts for the rich. Trump's billionaire advisors have said publicly on multiple occasions that tariff revenue will allow the government to, offset taxes in other areas and make steep tax cuts. The advisors may not love tariffs themselves, but they view the tariffs as temporary. And if tariffs end up excusing long-term tax reductions for themselves and their families, like, in their minds, that's a good trade-off. The other thing about tariffs, like as Trump uses them, is that they do fit in really perfectly with some of the core pieces of his personality and his political agenda. By which I mean like his long-held nationalist slash white supremacist beliefs, his plainly obvious egomania, his also obvious megalomania. And so if you think about those one by one, like in terms of white supremacy and nationalism, Um, the way that Trump uses tariffs obviously gives him a lot of power to pick and choose which countries he's allying with, which he isn't. And just this week, he sent Vice President J.D. Vance to London to talk about tariff reduction. And while there, I mean, first Vance talked about how much Trump loves and respects the king. But he also talked about how he's confident that the US and the UK will strike a deal that reduces tariffs because of the country's shared Anglo culture. That is a direct quote. Not shared labor and environmental standards, not shared history fighting Nazis, shared Anglo culture is why the UK's tariffs should be reduced. White supremacy is clearly at least part of this. In terms of Trump's egomania, the across the board tariffs now have countries lining up, kissing his butt, trying to get tariffs removed. This is something that Trump has literally bragged about in speeches in recent days. They're kissing my ass. Another direct quote. He says it gleefully. He brags about it. He loves that attention and people fawning over him and telling him what a great leader he is. So that probably plays a role. And then in terms of Trump's megalomania, meaning his authoritarianism, his interest in consolidating power so that he can wield that power over others. That fits in, not just with lording power over other countries' governments, but domestically too, right? Businesses, industries that want exemptions from the tariffs are now in a position where they have to petition the president for those exemptions. And, don't be surprised if those who align themselves with Trump and back him up politically get exemptions, and those who oppose what Trump is doing, see their businesses hurt. You could call it the Elon Musk effect or whatever else you want, but that's likely a play here too. The bottom line is like this is all about consolidated power and increased profits for Trump, for his family, for those around him. None of it is about making things better for working class Americans.
That's super helpful. I know that we don't have a ton of time left. Arthur, I might give you one more question, but there's a few things I wanted to respond to just quickly in the chat. For folks who are asking, there will be a follow-up email that goes out with all these links, so please be on the lookout for that. And I also wanted to address quickly, before we give Arthur one more question, that Iliana has told me very gently that I characterized the Sierra Club tool wrong. The notes that you input there are not going directly to your member of Congress. They're going to put them all into one big thank you note and send it to all the members that signed. So don't go through there looking for your member of Congress. Just sign your name. And she says individual comments are encouraged. So write something nice that they can send to the members of Congress who signed that letter. But yes, there will be a follow-up email with all the links and all of that. Arthur, one other question that I thought was really just an interesting one to talk about in this moment is, do you think it's generally better for us to be doing bilateral agreements than doing these like big IPEF 14 country trade deals? Like, is that somehow a better strategy, even though we don't like this one? Or do you have any input on that?
No, it's a super interesting question. I will say this. I do not trust that the Trump administration is going to be negotiating in working people's interest, in the environment's interest. And as such, these bilateral negotiations where Trump is sort of cherry picking, who's the most aligned with him and or who he has the most power over, is a really dangerous situation, especially if there's no, public input, there's no public participation, there's no oversight from the public or from Congress. That's a dangerous situation. That doesn't mean that we necessarily like these mega trade deals either, but in this current moment, it's something where we need to be paying a lot of attention. I will say in most instances, we don't see governments negotiating on the behalf of the majority. We see them negotiating on the behalf of corporate elites from their countries. It's sort of like not always easy, But at this moment, I think the bilaterals are very dangerous.
Thank you for that framing. So I think we're right at the end of our time. So I think we're going to leave the Q&A there for now. I would love if we could get some love for Arthur and Iliana for taking time to share with them. We're really, or taking time to share with us. We're really grateful to them for putting some time in their day. Please be on the lookout for that follow-up email. It is going to contain a recording of this call, links to review and sign the organizational sign-on letter, that thank you note action from Sierra Club, the resources that Arthur mentioned, and the invite to that documentary short screening. There's a lot going on in the trade justice organizing space, and we're excited for you to be a part of it. So please take a look at that when you receive the email. We look forward to continuing to push for good climate policy in the USMCA with you all. Thanks everyone so much. Have a great afternoon.